In the 200 years since its founding, Christ Church has been many things. It's been a place of history, a place of tradition, a place for community, and for family. But above all, it is a place of worship, a house of prayer, a place to celebrate the sacraments. And for generations, when the people of Christ Church have approached the altar to receive communion, they have knelt on the needlepoint kneelers that line the altar rail. The kneelers are not only beautiful, they are rich in symbolism. Let us take a moment to examine the meaning behind each image. The kneelers were made in 1940 by a small group of women from the parish. The project was led by Mrs. Dillard Harbour, who commissioned the patterns from a studio in Rye, New York. Under Mrs. Harbour's leadership, the panels were sewn by herself, Mrs. Walter J. Grace Jr., Mrs. James F. Brown Jr., and Mrs. B. P. O'Neill Jr. After the individual panels were sewn, they were sent to the studio in New York to be assembled and cushioned. Mrs. Brown also sewed 2 of the individual cushions bearing the IHS Christogram. In the early 1970s, several more of these individual kneelers were sewn following the same pattern by Mrs. Duncan D. Walker, Jr. The largest group of panels on the kneelers are 12 shields with symbols representing the 12 apostles. This first shield represents the Apostle Peter. The inverted cross refers to the tradition that Peter was crucified upside down because he did not feel worthy to die in the same way that Jesus had. The crossed keys represent Peter's leadership of the apostles, particularly Matthew 16, verses 18 and 19, in which Jesus says, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." The snake in the chalice represents the Apostle John, referring to a story from the apocryphal Acts of John, in which he is challenged to prove his faith by drinking a cup of poison, which he does and survives. John is traditionally believed to have been the youngest apostle, and to have outlived all the others, being the only one to die of old age after surviving many attempts on his life. The next shield represents the Apostle Matthias, who was chosen to replace Judas following his betrayal of Jesus and death. Matthias is usually symbolized by a book and a double-headed axe. This kneeler uses a less common variant, which replaces the axe with a scimitar. Regardless, both refer to his traditional martyrdom in Ethiopia. A similar set of symbols, a book and a sword, are often used to represent the Apostle Paul, but in his case the sword is usually a straight, double-edged sword, such as a Roman gladius. The panel with the saw represents the Apostle James the Less, also known as James the son of Alphaeus. Here, the less means younger, not less important, than the other Apostle James, the brother of John. The saw refers to a legend that James was martyred by being sawn in half. In other depictions, James is shown with a fuller's club, based on an alternate tradition that he was beaten to death. James the Great, also known as James the son of Zebedee, was the brother of the Apostle John. The sword represents his martyrdom. James is believed to have been the first of the apostles to be martyred, his death, ordered by Herod Agrippa, being recorded in the book of Acts. The scallop shell represents pilgrimage, and is particularly associated with the popular medieval pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where James's remains are traditionally believed to be interred. The Apostle Simon, also known as Simon the Zealot or Simon the Cananean to distinguish him from Simon Peter, is represented by a fish and a book. Like the Apostle James, Simon is often depicted with a saw, based on a similar tradition about his martyrdom. But in our kneeler, the symbolism focuses on his occupation as a fisherman, and his calling to become a fisher of men by spreading the gospel far beyond his native Galilee, traditionally as a companion of the apostle Jude. Bartholomew the Apostle, also called Nathaniel in the Gospel of John, is represented by 3 knives, based on the widespread tradition that he was martyred by flaying. Traditionally, he is believed to have traveled first to India and then to Armenia, where he was killed by being skinned alive and then beheaded. He is sometimes depicted holding his own skin. The Apostle Thomas is believed, based on very early and widespread traditions, to have carried the gospel far abroad, going first to Mesopotamia and then to India. His symbols, a square and a spear, reflect this tradition. The carpenter square represents his initial ministry in Kerala, in southwest India, where he is said to have built the first church in India with his own hands. Then, Thomas traveled to Tamil Nadu, in southeast India, where he was killed with a spear after offending a local king. The Christians of Kerala still refer to themselves as the Mar Thoma Church, in honor of Thomas's pioneering evangelism in the subcontinent. Andrew the Apostle was the brother of Peter. He is represented by an X-shaped or saltire cross, based on the early medieval tradition that he was crucified on such a cross in Scythia, the area that is now southern Ukraine. That cross, also known as St. Andrew's Cross because of the association with him, became a popular symbol in European heraldry, appearing in many crests and flags, including the flag of Scotland, through which it came to be incorporated into the shield of the Episcopal Church. The Apostle Matthew is represented by 3 coin purses. This is a reference to his previous occupation as a tax collector. In Matthew's own Gospel, he writes that he was sitting at his counting table when Jesus called him, and that, while Jesus was eating dinner in his house, many other tax collectors came to hear him speak. Matthew is believed to have ministered among the Jewish Christians in Judea, and then traveled to Ethiopia, where he was martyred. Jude the Apostle, in some places referred to as Thaddeus to distinguish him from Judas Iscariot, is represented in his shield with a sailing ship. Like the Apostle Simon, with whom he is traditionally paired, his symbol refers both to his origin as a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee and to his travels to spread the gospel. The 2 apostles are believed to have traveled together, first around Judea, then to Lebanon and Syria, and then ultimately to Armenia. The last of the shields represents the Apostle Philip. Philip has a Greek name and probably belonged to the community of Greek-speaking Jews. He is believed to have traveled spreading the gospel through Asia Minor into Greece. He is sometimes represented by a sideways cross, or, as in our kneeler, by a butted cross, with 3 knobs on the end of each line representing the Trinity. Though not present on the kneeler, the cross is usually accompanied by 2 loaves or 2 baskets, since he was present at the feeding of the 5,000, and was the one to ask Jesus how they were going to feed so many.